Welcome, dear listener, to another tranquil journey through the annals of history. As you settle into your cosy bed or favourite armchair, and we get ready to dive into tonight's trip into the Age of Discovery, I invite you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. It's always warming to know how vast our community of nocturnal historians reaches. If you enjoy these calm, meandering explorations of the past, consider subscribing to join our little community of history lovers seeking a restful night's sleep. Tonight, we embark on a journey back to a time when maps were still being drawn, and the unknown stretched endlessly before humanity. A time not of grand triumphs as commonly depicted, but of immense, pervasive suffering, relentless deprivation, and brutal realities. We will delve deeply into why life sucked for explorers during the Age of Discovery. Under the vast and often indifferent sky of the 15th and 16th centuries, an insidious blend of hope and desperation compelled men towards the unknown horizons. These were the explorers, figures often mythologized in the annals of history, yet whose daily existence was a relentless struggle against odds so staggering they defied common sense. Before the creaking timbers of their vessels even kissed the open sea, the seed of suffering was already sown in the very psychology of those who embarked on such perilous ventures. For many, the call of the unexplored was less a heroic aspiration, and more a desperate gamble, a last resort against the crushing weight of poverty and limited opportunity in their homeland. They harboured grand dreams of gold, glory, and new lands, whispered tales that spread like wildfire through taverns and marketplaces, fueling a desperate hope in the hearts of the downtrodden. Yet, beneath this shimmering veneer of potential triumph lay a brutal, unspoken truth. These expeditions were death traps, voyages into an almost certain oblivion. The allure was powerful, especially for those born into obscurity with no discernible path to betterment. A common seaman, a dispossessed farmer, or even a minor nobleman without inheritance, might see a glimmer of possibility in joining an expedition, even if it meant venturing into the darkest corners of the earth. But this promise came at a terrifying price. Recruitment was often less about seeking skilled navigators and more about filling berths with any able-bodied man, desperate or foolish enough to sign on. The parting scenes on the docks were rarely triumphant send-offs. Instead, they were solemn, often silent farewells, fraught with the unspoken understanding that these might be the very last glimpses loved ones had of each other. The vast majority of these adventurers would never see their homes again, swallowed by the ocean, succumbing to disease, or meeting violent ends in alien lands. This foreboding shadow of death hung heavy over every embarkation, a constant, chilling reminder of the finality of their decision. The legal frameworks of these voyages offered little solace, instead cementing the explorers' precarious positions. Maritime contracts of the era were notoriously brutal, heavily biased towards the patrons and captains, effectively rendering the crew members as little more than chattel for the duration of the voyage. Wages, if they were promised at all, were often contingent upon the expedition's success, and sometimes withheld for months, or even years, upon return. Any misstep, insubordination, or perceived breach of contract could lead to severe punishment, often on the spot, with little recourse. There were no labour laws to protect them, no oversight to ensure fair treatment. Once a man signed his name, or simply made his mark, on the ship's roster, he became property of the mission. The ship itself transformed into a prison, its walls the hull, its ceiling the deck above, offering no means of escape save the frigid, unforgiving ocean. For most, withdrawing from a voyage once committed was akin to desertion, a crime punishable by death, leaving them with no viable path but forward into the deepening unknown. It was, unequivocally, a journey with no turning back. Indeed, a dispassionate look at the demographics of these early explorer crews reveals a stark truth. Many, if not most, of these adventurers were the era's equivalent of desperate gamblers. They were individuals for whom conventional society offered no upward mobility, no secure future, no dignity. The exploration narrative, as often spun by the patrons and monarchs, focused on grand narratives of empire and faith. Yet, for the average man sweating below deck, the reality was far more visceral, a simple, primal wager of life against potential reward. A sailor might possess nothing more than the ragged clothes on his back and the faint hope of a distant fortune that could alleviate his family's suffering, or simply grant him a plot of land and a measure of respect in his old age. His entire existence was placed on the table, his very life becoming a commodity traded for a fraction of what any discovered riches might yield. The immense, unquantifiable value of human life was reduced to a speculative investment in a risky endeavour. They poured their remaining reserves of energy and dwindling courage into the belief that their sacrifice would be justified, if not by wealth, then perhaps by simply escaping the misery of their former lives. They were expendable components in a grand machine of expansion, their suffering unseen, their deaths unmourned in the official chronicles, merely footnotes in the glorious tales of their more fortunate or ruthless captains. Their legacy, if any, lay only in the empty berths that followed them back to port. Beyond the fleeting exhilaration or crushing despair of departure, the explorers' true misery began within the confines of the ship itself. These vessels, though grand in ambition and iconic in historical memory, were, in practice, floating prisons, barely fit for human habitation over prolonged periods. For months, sometimes years, on end, the vast majority of the crew existed in an almost perpetual state of intimate discomfort, crammed into spaces barely large enough for their bodies, let alone their spirits. Personal space was an unimaginable luxury. Sailors slept in hammocks slung tightly together, often sharing these with others in shifts, or on meagre, straw-filled mattresses on the deck. The hammocks, adopted for their efficiency in space, offered no privacy, no respite from the sounds and smells of their dozens of fellow sufferers. The slightest movement, the weakest cough, the softest groan from a neighbour could shatter any hope of true rest, adding to the pervasive weariness. Living chests, the only repository for their meagre belongings, were pushed up against one another, forming an indistinguishable mass of human clutter, all packed into decks with ceilings often too low to allow a man to stand fully upright. The distinction between day and night blurred into a perpetual dimness, as sunlight rarely penetrated beyond the upper decks, casting an eternal twilight over their grim existence below. The air itself, a vital element of life, became a source of ceaseless torment. Down below deck, the atmosphere was a heavy, stagnant soup of human exhalations. The acrid stench of unwashed bodies, stale food, and the raw, lingering scent of animal waste from any livestock brought aboard. Compounding this, the ships, by their very nature, were constantly damp. Seawater routinely found its way through cracks and seams in the hull, or cascaded down stairwells during rough seas. This relentless humidity, combined with the lack of proper ventilation, created a perfect breeding ground for mildew and mould, which spread across every surface wooden beams, ropes, sails, and even the crew's sparse clothing and bedding. The constant presence of this mould filled the air with a sickly, earthy odour, adding to the general putrefaction and contributing to persistent respiratory ailments among the crew. Adding to this misery were the ship's unintended, yet inevitable passengers, an unseen multitude of vermin. Cockroaches scurried over everything, invading food supplies and finding their way into the hammocks at night. But far more disturbing were the rats. These brazen rodents were an ever-present menace, gnawing through provisions, contaminating water, and sometimes even biting sleeping sailors. Their omnipresent droppings and scurrying movements amplified the sense of squalor and desperation within the wooden hull. The consequences of this pervasive squalor on the sailors' personal hygiene were immediate and profound, creating a truly repellent environment. For months on end, fresh water was far too precious to be used for washing. It was rationed strictly for drinking, and barely for cooking. Baths were an impossibility. Clothes, few in number and heavy in fabric, were worn continuously, growing stiff with salt, grime, and the accumulating sweat and oils of human skin. Lice, fleas, and other parasitic insects became an unwelcome, permanent companion, clinging to hair and body, causing relentless itching and discomfort. Without relief, constant scratching often broke the skin, leading to open sores and lesions that, in the contaminated environment, quickly festered and became infected. These minor cuts and abrasions often progressed into more serious skin diseases, such as impetigo or debilitating fungal infections, spreading rapidly from one individual to another in the close quarters. The stench that permeated the living areas was a direct testament to this forced neglect of hygiene, a permanent marker of their suffering. Beyond the shared torment of filth and cramped conditions, a stark, often brutal hierarchy governed life aboard the vessels. While common seamen endured the suffocating misery of the lower decks, forced to endure the worst of the dampness, the foul air, and the omnipresent vermin, the ship's officers, the captain, and other ranking individuals enjoyed markedly different circumstances. The officers often had dedicated, if still modest, cabins, usually located on the higher decks. These cabins, though by modern standards cramped, offered precious, unquantifiable luxuries: a degree of privacy, a small window for natural light and air, and most importantly, a space to retreat from the ceaseless clamour and stench of the common quarters. While fresh water remained a scarce resource for all, officers had greater access to washing facilities and often better quality food, some of which might even be fresh or preserved to a higher standard. This blatant disparity in living conditions not only highlighted the brutal class divisions of the era, but also served to emphasise the immense power wielded by the captain and his lieutenants. Their elevated status, physical comfort, and relative freedom stood in stark contrast to the gruelling, subhuman conditions faced by the common sailor. This hierarchy created a persistent undercurrent of resentment and despair, where the ordinary crew members were not just battling the elements and unknown dangers, but also enduring the daily indignity of a social order that relegated them to suffering, all while those in charge existed in comparatively luxurious circumstances. The ship, thus, was not just a means of transport, but a microcosm of societal injustice, where survival was predicated not merely on skill or endurance, but on one's assigned place in an unforgiving social pecking order. Beyond the biting cold of the sea and the suffocating squalor of the lower decks, an even more insidious enemy awaited the explorers, one that stalked them with chilling patience: disease. Chief among these silent assassins was scurvy, a malady that etched its grotesque mark on the faces and bodies of countless seamen, leaving behind a legacy of pain, disfigurement, and ultimately an agonizing demise. Its onset was often subtle, almost imperceptible at first, beginning with a creeping lethargy, a general fatigue that mirrored the pervasive exhaustion of maritime life. But gradually, insidiously, its true horrors would manifest. The gums of the affected sailors would begin to swell, becoming soft and spongy, a grotesque canvas of inflammation that soon began to bleed with the slightest touch, or even spontaneously. Teeth, once firmly rooted, would loosen and then fall out, leaving ghastly gaps and making the consumption of the meagre, hard rations an unbearable torture. The body's connective tissues began to break down. Old wounds, long since healed, would reopen with unsettling regularity, oozing pus and stubbornly refusing to close. Skin would become covered in dark, bruised spots, a terrifying mosaic of internal hemorrhages as capillaries burst just beneath the surface. Swollen joints made every movement a scream of agony, rendering once able men helpless, reduced to writhing heaps on the unforgiving decks. The final stages were marked by severe muscle weakness, laboured breathing, and a profound bone-deep apathy, where the will to live simply faded away, leaving the victim a pallid shadow of their former self, awaiting a slow, inevitable dissolution. The tragic irony of scurvy was that its cause, a simple vitamin C deficiency, was entirely unknown for centuries. Sailors and medical practitioners alike, confounded by its bizarre and gruesome symptoms, offered theories ranging from stale air to excessive exertion, from corrupted water to spiritual malaise. Consequently, the remedies proposed were, at best, utterly ineffective, and at worst, actively harmful. Bleeding, purging, administering noxious concoctions, these interventions often weakened the victim further, hastening their inevitable decline. Even when empirical evidence, like the observations of Vasco da Gama, who witnessed 2/3 of his crew perish from it, hinted at fresh food as a palliative, the lack of a scientific understanding meant these isolated instances of successful prevention were not systematically adopted. The ship became a charnel house, the disease picking off sailors one by one, each death serving as a horrifying prophecy for the remaining crew. The grim procession was continuous, with new bodies consigned to the waves almost daily, turning the vast ocean into an immense, unremarked cemetery. From Magellan's epic circumnavigation, which saw 80% of his original crew lost largely to disease, to Vasco da Gama's inaugural voyage to India, where the crew of one ship was so decimated by scurvy that it had to be burnt, its survivors distributed amongst the remaining vessels, these voyages became grim case studies in the catastrophic impact of this silent killer. Yet, scurvy was merely one of the many pathogens that feasted on the vulnerable bodies of explorers. Infectious diseases thrived in the cramped, unsanitary conditions, transforming ships into incubators of death. Dysentery, often called bloody flux, was a frequent and devastating visitor. Spread by contaminated food and water, which were staples of sea life, its symptoms were truly gruesome. Incessant, agonizing abdominal cramps followed by profuse, bloody diarrhea that rapidly led to severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. The weakened state of the sailors made them particularly susceptible, and the speed with which it spread through the confined quarters could decimate a crew in a matter of days. A man could be healthy one morning and dead by the next. Then there was typhus, or ship fever, a tormenting scourge transmitted by the humble body louse, a creature omnipresent on unwashed bodies and clothes. It manifested as a searing fever, a relentless headache, muscle aches, and often a characteristic rash across the body. The delirium it induced would lead to confused ravings and a slow slip into unconsciousness, often ending in death. Beyond the physical pain, the terror of contagions was psychological, an invisible assailant capable of sweeping through the entire crew, turning robust men into skeletal figures racked with shivers and internal fire. Each agonizing breath, a reminder of impending doom. And while some diseases, like smallpox, are more famously known for the devastation they wreaked upon the indigenous populations encountered by European explorers, it was equally a deadly threat to the Europeans themselves. In communities where it was not endemic, exposure could lead to swift and agonizing death. Explorers, inadvertently carrying pathogens, would not only spread suffering outwards, but also often suffered internal outbreaks that further decimated their already dwindling ranks. The lack of proper sanitation, as discussed, acted as a powerful accelerant for all these illnesses. Feces and vomit were often left uncleaned, seeping into the wooden structures, contaminating communal spaces and drawing flies that then transmitted the disease to every morsel of food. Stale, brackish water, stored in unhygienic casks, became breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites, contributing to perpetual stomach ailments and infections. The relentless cycle of poor hygiene, inadequate diet, and lack of medical knowledge created a lethal environment where even the common cold could escalate into life-threatening pneumonia for an already weakened individual. In the face of such relentless suffering, medical knowledge on board these vessels was shockingly rudimentary, almost pitifully inadequate. Dedicated, trained doctors were a rarity, reserved for only the largest or most important expeditions. More commonly, a ship would have a barber surgeon, whose training often amounted to little more than battlefield amputations and crude bloodletting techniques, a horrifying testament to the limited understanding of the human body and disease. Instruments were few and crude. Knowledge of anatomy or antiseptic practices was almost non-existent. Cures often consisted of the practices inherited from medieval times: cupping, purging, blistering, and above all, copious bleeding, which invariably weakened the patient further, drawing out their already meagre reserves of strength. Infections, once they took hold, often led to amputation if they reached a limb, performed with sores that had not seen a sterile wipe. Pain relief was minimal to non-existent. In such desperate circumstances, reliance often shifted from the corporeal to the spiritual. Prayers became as potent as any poultice, superstition as prevalent as medical doctrine. Charms, blessings, and fervent supplications to God and various saints were deemed just as vital for survival as any physical intervention, perhaps offering psychological comfort in the face of absolute despair. The true toll of these voyages, however, was rarely enumerated in heroic verses or grand chronicles. Disease, rather than glorious battle or dramatic shipwreck, was, by an overwhelming margin, the single greatest killer of explorers during the Age of Discovery. Mortality rates were staggering. A common long-distance voyage could see more than half its crew succumb to illness before reaching their destination or returning home. Some expeditions experienced catastrophic losses, with 80% or even 90% of the crew dying. It wasn't unusual for a ship to arrive at a distant port with barely enough able-bodied men to man the sails, their original robust crew replaced by emaciated ghosts. This immense attrition had profound practical implications. Without enough sailors, vital tasks like maintaining the sails, pumping out bilges, or navigating became impossible burdens for the dwindling few. A ship filled with sick or dying men was a ship unable to sail, adrift in the vast emptiness, a testament to humanity's tragic overreach. The immense human cost, these forgotten deaths, far outnumbered any triumphs. For every famed discoverer, 1,000 nameless lives ended in slow agony, their bodies anonymously committed to the depths, their suffering unrecorded, save for the bitter memory in the minds of the few survivors. They were the anonymous sacrifices on the altar of progress and imperial ambition. As if the threats of disease and cramped living were not enough, the explorers of the Age of Discovery faced another pervasive and agonizing enemy. Hunger, not as a sudden deprivation, but as a grinding, constant companion, punctuated by the horror of rotten, infested sustenance. The diet aboard these long-distance voyages was astonishingly monotonous, built purely for endurance rather than nourishment. The staples were hardtack, or ship's biscuit, and salted meat, often pork or beef, preserved in brine. These provisions, chosen for their supposed durability, were intended to last for months, even years. However, this longevity came at a terrible cost. A profound lack of vital nutrients, particularly fresh produce. The hardtack was precisely that: rock, hard, unpalatable, and often requiring soaking in water or stew to become edible. It was little more than a vehicle for calories, lacking fibre and essential vitamins. The salted meat, though intended to prevent putrefaction, often retained a ghastly salinity that dehydrated the body, exacerbated thirst, and offered minimal pleasure, providing only a dense, tough source of protein, but nothing more. The conditions of storage aboard these wooden ships were far from ideal, a recipe for inevitable spoilage and infestation. Packed tightly into dark, often damp holds, away from direct sunlight, the food provisions were nevertheless subject to the fluctuations of humidity, temperature, and the constant rocking of the vessel. Biscuits, though hard, would gradually absorb moisture from the humid air, turning soft and crumbly, fostering the growth of moulds, a sickly green or black fuzz coating their surfaces. This mould was not simply unpleasant to the eye or nose, it often produced mycotoxins, contributing to widespread digestive distress among the crew. Salted meat, despite its preservation, was also prone to deterioration. The brining process, while effective for initial preservation, could not prevent slow desiccation, and if the brine weakened, putrefaction could set in. The meat would become rank, developing an unbearable odour and an oily, discoloured appearance. When such conditions were unavoidable, crews often resorted to rinsing the meat in seawater to superficially wash away the worst of the brine, and scraping off the worst of the mould and decay from the biscuits, then cooking the meagre rations with copious amounts of water, desperate attempts to make the unbearable marginally edible. Beyond the visible signs of decay, an invisible scuttling horror often permeated every aspect of their diet: insects and rodents. The ships, serving as self-contained ecosystems, inevitably harboured a vast population of vermin, particularly weevils, beetles, and, most pervasively, rats. Ship's biscuit, often baked months in advance and stored without hermetic seals, became an ideal breeding ground for weevils. These small, dark beetles burrowed into the biscuit, turning it into a porous, powdery substance. Eating a biscuit meant consuming not only its dry, crumbling form, but also the myriad larvae and adult insects nestled within, an added texture of grim life. The visual revulsion of these creatures, emerging from their staple food, along with the unsettling crunch when accidentally consumed, was a daily torment. Rats, meanwhile, were a persistent menace. They scurried through the holds, contaminating barrels of fresh food, gnawing through ropes and provisions, and leaving droppings wherever they went. Their waste fouled everything it touched, creating a conduit for disease, and their constant presence in the darkest corners of the hold fostered an atmosphere of perpetual unease. It was not uncommon for a crewman to awake to a rat gnawing on his clothes or even biting his bare skin, further intensifying the terror and discomfort that were an everyday part of life at sea. Water, even more precious than solid food, presented its own severe challenges. Stored in large wooden casks, it was prone to contamination and rapid deterioration in quality. Stagnant and poorly aerated, it quickly became foul, growing thick with algae, larvae, and bacteria. It developed a noxious smell and a sickly taste, a testament to the microbial life flourishing within. Drinking this brackish, unpalatable fluid was often a nauseating ordeal, yet abstaining was impossible. Fresh water was rationed with the utmost severity, sometimes reduced to barely a pint per day, an agonizing pittance for men toiling under the relentless sun and wind. Thirst, deep and burning, became a constant ache, far worse than hunger. The body craved the cool, life-giving liquid, but instead received a tepid, often slime-filled potion. This severe dehydration led to further complications: headaches, dizziness, lethargy, and a dry, cracked throat, making speech, and even breathing, a painful experience. Many succumbed not to direct starvation, but to the slow, excruciating drain of chronic dehydration, a truly miserable end in the midst of boundless water that mocked their suffering. When all standard provisions dwindled, as they often did during unforeseen delays, prolonged storms, or navigational errors that stretched voyages far beyond their anticipated length, desperation would drive men to unimaginable extremes. Starvation transformed civilized individuals into primal beings. Sailors would first turn to the ship itself for sustenance, gnawing on parts of the vessel's structure or accessories. Leather straps, candles made from tallow, and even pieces of wood from the ship's spare parts, desperately trying to extract any caloric content from materials never intended for consumption. The hunt for rats became an intense, sometimes competitive activity, as these rodents, previously viewed with disgust, now represented a precious, if meagre, source of protein. A single rat might be fought over, its stringy meat boiled and distributed with sombre ceremony, a sign of absolute rock bottom. The truly terrifying abyss of starvation was reached when even these abhorrent measures proved insufficient. Stories, chillingly factual rather than mere legend, tell of cannibalism, the ultimate taboo being resorted to. During Magellan's circumnavigation, when provisions ran out, sailors were reduced to eating leather, sawdust and rats, before finally resorting to consuming their dead comrades. These were not acts of malice, but of extreme, desperate survival, etched forever as the most disturbing testament to the horrors of protracted famine at sea. Each mouthful, born of unthinkable necessity, came at a cost beyond mere sustenance. It left an indelible psychological scar, a chilling memory of human limits pushed beyond all reason. The silent screams of hunger filled the empty hold, leaving nothing but an unimaginable desolation in its wake. Beyond the internal horrors of disease and starvation, the explorers confronted the boundless and enigmatic expanse of the ocean itself, a realm where knowledge was scarce and uncertainty reigned supreme. The very tools with which they attempted to tame this vastness were, by modern standards, woefully rudimentary, inherently prone to error, and utterly insufficient for the monumental task at hand. Navigational instruments like the astrolabe and quadrant were cutting edge for their time, sophisticated devices that allowed sailors to ascertain their latitude by measuring the angle of the sun or a star above the horizon. Yet, their accuracy was profoundly limited. A rolling ship, the ceaseless pitching and swaying of the deck, rendered precise observations almost impossible. The observer's body itself became part of the instability, swaying with the rhythm of the waves, leading to wildly inconsistent readings. Clouds or fog could obscure the celestial bodies entirely for days, sometimes weeks, leaving navigators blind and without a fixed reference point. Moreover, the crucial element of longitude a ship's east-west position remained an insurmountable riddle. Without accurate chronometers, which were centuries away, measuring longitude was guesswork. Reliant on dead reckoning, estimating distance travelled and direction from the last known point. This method, a blend of experience and perilous speculation, meant that while an explorer might know roughly how far north or south they had sailed, their true east-west position could be hundreds of miles off, turning every journey into a precarious dance with spatial oblivion. The limitations of these primitive instruments were compounded by the formidable, often violent, and utterly unpredictable forces of nature that defined the age of discovery. The mighty oceans were not just a vast emptiness, but a tempestuous arena, where human ambition clashed with raw, elemental power. Gale-force winds could rip through sails, shredding canvas into ribbons and leaving vessels adrift. Towering waves, often described as mountains of water, crashed over decks, washing men overboard, smashing masts, and tearing away precious equipment. Thunderstorms brought with them torrential rains and blinding lightning, plunging the already small world of the ship into an apocalyptic chaos. Then there was the insidious threat of fog, a thick, impenetrable blanket that could descend without warning, engulfing an entire fleet and turning it into a procession of lost echoes. In such conditions, visibility dropped to mere feet, severing communication between ships, leading to collisions, or the agonizing uncertainty of being irrevocably separated. These meteorological hazards were not just inconvenient delays, they were existential threats, each storm capable of shattering a ship into driftwood, sending entire crews to their watery graves without a trace, reducing their grand endeavours to whispered warnings of a world untamed. The physical dangers of navigation extended beyond weather. The very topography of the submerged world posed constant threats. Hidden reefs, vast, treacherous expanses of submerged rock lay just beneath the surface, silent executioners waiting to tear open the hull of a vessel. A sudden change in depth, or a miscalculation in the uncharted waters of newly discovered coastlines, could lead to catastrophic grounding. The grating, grinding sound of timber scraping against rock was the prelude to terror. A ship slowly succumbing to the relentless pressure, water rushing into the hold, its life draining away. When a ship ran aground or struck a reef, it was rarely a gentle affair. The forces involved could shatter the vessel in minutes, casting sailors into the roiling seas, their chances of survival slim. The most terrifying scenario, however, was complete disappearance. Entire expeditions, well equipped and crewed, vanished into the vastness of the Pacific or Atlantic without sending back even a whisper. They were simply swallowed by the waves, lost to history, their fates left to the dark imaginings of those who waited ashore. For hundreds of years, maritime charts remained littered with speculative islands, ghost lands, and doubtful existences, places drawn onto maps from a single, unreliable sighting, serving as testament to the imprecise nature of their surveys and the widespread uncertainty that plagued every expedition. For the sailors themselves, the continuous palpable uncertainty of their location was a relentless psychological burden, gnawing at their sanity with every passing day. With no accurate way to measure longitude, they could only guess at their east-west position, often for weeks at a time. The constant possibility of being hundreds of miles off course, of having already sailed past their intended destination, or worse, of charting a completely new, incorrect course for centuries to come, created an atmosphere of persistent doubt and existential dread. Imagine staring out at the same unchanging horizon, day after day, week after week, with no fixed points of reference, no familiar constellations beyond a certain latitude, just the vast, indifferent expanse of water. This endless, featureless monotony amplified feelings of hopelessness and insignificance. The knowledge that any navigational error could mean a disastrous delay, a fatal detour, or eternal wandering on the high seas weighed heavily on the minds of navigators and ordinary seamen alike. Even more profoundly, there was the terror of being forever lost. Truly adrift, not just from land, but from the known world. Tales of phantom islands and ships endlessly wandering, never to find port, haunted their collective imagination. This pervasive anxiety, this constant feeling of being untethered from any verifiable position, was a profound and constant psychological torment, leaving them suspended in a terrifying state of spatial purgatory. Beyond the immediate, practical perils, the age of discovery was fraught with an almost primal fear of the utterly unknown. These weren't simply empty spaces on a map. They were voids filled with terrifying legends, monstrous creatures, and mythical abysses whispered in sailors' taverns. Sea serpents large enough to capsize ships, whirlpools that could swallow entire fleets, and treacherous currents that pulled vessels to the edge of the world. These were not mere children's stories, but widely believed threats that populated the minds of the men venturing into uncharted waters. While today we understand the scientific basis of ocean currents and weather patterns to these early explorers, these phenomena were inexplicable, often attributed to supernatural forces or divine displeasure. Each storm could be a leviathan's breath, each calm a deceptive lure from a siren. This profound ignorance, combined with deeply ingrained superstitions, transformed every ripple on the surface and every cloud in the sky into a potential omen of disaster. The maps of the era, crude and incomplete, often depicted fantastic beasts or ominous warnings in their unexplored sections, illustrating this collective fear. The psychological burden of confronting a world so vast, so powerful, and so fundamentally unknowable weighed heavily on their minds. It meant every horizon potentially held, not glory, but monstrous annihilation and every passing day brought them deeper into an unfathomable emptiness, where sanity could fray and break, overwhelmed by the sheer, unquantifiable dread of the uncharted sea. Beyond the palpable physical torments of scurvy, starvation, and storms, a more insidious adversary relentlessly assailed the explorers during their protracted journeys: the mind itself. Long voyages across vast, featureless oceans, severed from every familiar anchor of society and sensation, transformed the human brain into a crucible of despair. The boundless silence of the open sea, punctuated only by the ceaseless groaning of timbers and the rhythmic slapping of waves against the hull, became a profound source of torment. This wasn't merely quietude. It was an active absence, a void where the mind, stripped of external stimulation, turned inward, cannibalizing itself. Monotony bred an unbearable mental stillness that slowly chipped away at one's resilience, eroding the very fabric of reason. For men accustomed to the vibrant, chaotic pulse of bustling port towns or the rooted rhythms of agricultural life, this profound isolation became a form of psychological torture, subtly pushing them towards a precipice of profound mental distress. One of the most debilitating psychological afflictions suffered by these early voyagers was a condition known simply as nostalgia, or more colloquially, homesickness. However, unlike the romanticized notion of a gentle longing, in centuries past, nostalgia was a clinically recognized, severe illness capable of inducing extreme physical and mental deterioration, leading to apathy, profound melancholia, and in acute cases, even death. It was not merely an emotional ache, but a systemic collapse of spirit. Imagine being severed from the very soil of your existence, the sights, sounds, smells, and touch of familiar landscapes, the faces of loved ones, the comforting cadences of your native tongue, the certainty of community. Every sense was deprived, leaving an aching vacuum that no horizon, however distant, could fill. Day after day, weeks melting into months, the crushing weight of absence pressed down. Dreams became vivid, haunting visitations of home, often more real than their waking nightmares. Waking, however, brought only the stark, desolate reality of an endlessly stretching ocean, amplifying the pangs of longing to an almost unbearable pitch, reducing robust men to listless shadows, their vitality draining away into a quiet, pervasive anguish. Compounding this pervasive homesickness was the peculiar, often maddening paradox of life aboard these ships. Physical proximity combined with profound emotional isolation. Though hundreds of men might be crammed into claustrophobic spaces, shoulder to shoulder, in the fetid holds, genuine privacy, and thus any true opportunity for emotional expression or catharsis, was virtually non-existent. There was nowhere to retreat, nowhere to be truly alone with one's thoughts, nowhere to weep or express fear without witnesses. Yet, paradoxically, intimate human connection was also largely absent. The constant competition for space, the raw realities of survival, and the oppressive presence of a rigid, unforgiving social hierarchy often discouraged anything more than the most superficial camaraderie. Expressing vulnerability was seen as weakness, a luxury that could be exploited in an environment where even minor failings were brutally punished. Trust was a scarce commodity, especially among men often forced together by economic desperation rather than shared affection. This environment of suppressed emotion and forced interaction led to a unique form of profound loneliness, where men were constantly surrounded by others, yet felt utterly, terribly alone. The unspoken suffering created an invisible wall between them, trapping each individual within their own internal torment, a quiet anguish that resonated through the cramped quarters. The mind, when deprived of external stimulation, finds its own avenues for activity, and often these were grim. The endless monotony of maritime life, punctuated only by the rhythm of watches, the tending of sails, and the preparation of their unappetizing rations, fostered a unique brand of mental decay. Weeks bled into months, each sunrise indistinguishable from the last. each sunset mirroring the previous one. This relentless tedium, coupled with chronic sleep deprivation, a diet woefully deficient in nutrients, and the general bodily suffering, conspired to erode mental sharpness. For many, intellectual faculties dulled, their capacity for complex thought or even simple recollection diminishing. The brain, no longer engaged with varied stimuli, began to dwell on its own anxieties, its own regrets, its own terrors. The future seemed an unalterable expanse of the present misery, while the past became a tormenting memory of a life forever lost. This inward turning could lead to repetitive, obsessive thinking, reinforcing feelings of helplessness and deepening despair, making every waking moment a subtle form of mental anguish, a silent, pervasive ache in the deepest parts of their being. In some of the more extreme, though regrettably common cases, the combination of extreme sensory deprivation, psychological pressure, and physiological stress culminated in overt symptoms of mental breakdown. Tales of explorers experiencing vivid hallucinations became distressingly common. Malnourished, sleep-deprived, and often feverish from disease, sailors reported seeing mirages of land where none existed, their parched minds conjuring fertile green shores that would then vanish into the empty ocean. Others claimed to hear voices, the whispers of absent loved ones, or ominous forebodings, sounds that mocked their desperate sanity. Some experienced full-blown delirium, driven to bizarre and erratic behaviour by their fevered brains. Instances of acute psychosis, characterised by disorganised thoughts, extreme paranoia, and aggressive outbursts, were not uncommon, disrupting the already fragile peace of the ship. Men might simply withdraw into themselves, lapsing into catatonic states, or conversely, be seized by a frantic energy, pacing the decks erratically, talking to themselves, their eyes haunted and vacant. These were not mere eccentricities, but desperate cries from minds fracturing under unimaginable stress. For a chilling number of men, the weight of this mental anguish proved too great, leading them to desperate, irreversible acts. The vast, indifferent ocean that represented discovery for some became a welcoming void for others. Accounts, chillingly matter-of-fact, record instances of sailors, overwhelmed by despair, deliberately throwing themselves overboard, preferring the swift, cold embrace of the depths to the prolonged agony of their existence aboard ship. They simply slipped away from the crew, driven to an act of ultimate desperation by the silent screams in their own minds. For others, the act of giving up was less dramatic but equally final. Succumbing to an almost total psychological exhaustion, they would simply refuse to eat, refuse to engage, and would slowly, quietly lie down in their hammocks or on the deck, letting disease or starvation claim them. Their spirit, having fractured beyond repair, had abandoned the body long before its physical functions ceased. Such quiet surrenders were terrifying to witness for their comrades, serving as grim warnings of the thin line between sanity and absolute mental obliteration, a haunting reminder that the spirit, like the body, possessed a breaking point that, once crossed, offered no return. Beyond their immediate personal torments, a persistent, gnawing fear for loved ones left behind gnawed at the souls of many explorers. Cut off from all communication for months, if not years, the lack of news was a relentless form of torture. Had their families survived the plague that swept through towns? Were their children well? Would their spouses remain faithful? Or would they, in their own desperation, believe them dead and remarry? There was no way for them to send word, no means to receive any comfort or information. Every strong gust of wind, every delayed arrival at a distant port, every rumour carried on the trade winds only intensified these anxieties. They lived with the agonising possibility that by the time, if ever, they returned, the world they knew and the people they loved would have moved on, been destroyed, or simply forgotten them. This separation was absolute, a profound void that amplified the emotional isolation of the journey, making the very idea of return a gamble not just of survival, but of identity and belonging. The mental image of their families, once a source of comfort, now became a haunting spectre of their own unresolved fate, forever distant and beyond their desperate grasp. In an age before scientific understanding of many phenomena, superstition became a powerful, if ultimately unhelpful, framework for interpreting the overwhelming and terrifying experiences at sea. Every unexplained event, a sudden shift in wind, an unusual wave, a particularly bright meteor shower, could be interpreted as an omen, a divine sign of blessing or, more frequently, impending doom. Whispers of sea monsters, vengeful spirits, or ships doomed by curses spread like contagion among the already traumatized crew, feeding into pre-existing anxieties. A rumor that someone on board had wronged God or harbored ill intentions could escalate into mass hysteria, with sailors desperate to find a scapegoat for their misfortunes. This reliance on the irrational, while providing a desperate semblance of control, also exacerbated fears, plunging crews into collective panic and heightening individual mental fragility. The ship, already a breeding ground for physical disease, also became a vector for widespread psychological contagion, where individual terrors compounded into a shared, debilitating psychosis, driven by the profound need to find meaning in an unexplainable, malevolent world. The oppressive military discipline on board, while essential for control in such an isolated and dangerous environment, paradoxically served as another major psychological stressor, crushing any remaining vestiges of dignity or free will. The captain, possessing absolute authority akin to a dictator on his floating realm, could wield his power with arbitrary and often brutal force. Minor infractions, simple mistakes made in exhaustion, or even perceived disrespect, could result in harsh corporal punishment. The public lashing with a cat o' nine tails, confinement in the stocks, or being clapped in irons. The fear of these unpredictable and painful punishments fostered an environment of constant tension and suppressed rage among the crew. This arbitrary authority created a perpetual state of vigilance, eroding trust among shipmates who might be compelled to betray each other to curry favour, and extinguishing any hope of equitable treatment. This psychological repression, born from constant fear of a captain's capricious anger, stifled all genuine human connection and reduced men to their most primitive, self-preservative instincts, deepening the abyss of their internal suffering and fueling a slow-burning resentment that occasionally flared into open, deadly rebellion. And finally, for the rare few who endured the unimaginable and returned home, the end of the voyage did not mean the end of suffering. The psychological scars remained, often for life. The modern concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, though unnamed at the time, perfectly encapsulates the invisible wounds carried by these survivors. Many struggled to readjust to land life, finding the routines mundane, the crowds overwhelming, and the security jarringly unfamiliar after years of extreme uncertainty. Sleep was often plagued by vivid nightmares of storms, starvation, and dying comrades. Episodes of profound anxiety, depression, and social detachment were common. They were often unable to articulate the horrors they had witnessed, or the depths of their suffering to a world that could not possibly comprehend it. Their experiences made them outsiders, marked by something beyond human understanding, destined to live in the shadow of their voyages. For many, these psychological torments remained a silent burden, a daily struggle, to a testament to the profound and lasting impact of what it truly meant to have explored the limits of human endurance, in an era when the ocean still held more mystery than certainty. Their ghosts sailed on, long after their bodies were returned to land. If the unseen horrors of disease and mental decay gnawed at the explorer from within, the forces of nature waged a relentless assault from without, directly threatening their very physical existence. Beyond the psychological torment of uncertainty, the explorers lived in a perpetual state of readiness, for the direct, often cataclysmic, wrath of the elements. The boundless expanse of the ocean was not a calm, tranquil highway, but a violent arena where humanity's ambition faced the raw, untamed power of the world. Foremost among these manifest dangers were the tempests, hurricanes, gales, and squalls that could materialize with terrifying speed, transforming a placid sea into a boiling maelstrom within hours. The onset of such a storm was a prelude to pure, unadulterated terror, the sky darkening to an ominous, bruised purple, the wind beginning to shriek through the rigging like a banshee, and the ocean surface transforming from a gentle swell into a churning chaos of towering waves. To witness a fully developed storm from the deck of a 15th or 16th century sailing ship was to behold an apocalyptic scene. These vessels, though marvels of their age in design and construction, were ultimately fragile wooden shells, painstakingly cobbled together from planks and ropes, utterly dwarfed and profoundly vulnerable in the face of nature's fury. The waves, sometimes reaching the height of a multi-story building, would crash over the bow and sides with deafening force, deluging the deck, tearing at the sails, and threatening to rip away anything not firmly lashed down. Water cascaded down open hatches, rapidly filling the holds below, requiring constant back-breaking work at the pumps just to keep the vessel afloat. The entire ship would groan and shriek under the immense strain, its timbers flexing and twisting, producing sounds that echoed like a giant's tortured cry. Every lurch, every sudden plunge down a trough, and every violent slap of water against the hull was a terrifying reminder of the wood's fragility and the immense pressure that threatened to splinter it apart at any moment. Lightning strikes were an ever-present fear during such electrical storms, capable of splitting masts or igniting the ship, turning it into a funeral pyre on the raging seas. Life on deck during these extreme weather events was a desperate, unceasing struggle for survival. Sailors, perpetually drenched and exhausted, were forced to battle the elements directly. Their duty required them to climb the swaying masts and yards, to furl sail-san immensely perilous task as the ship pitched and rolled wildly, often in complete darkness, with the added dangers of freezing spray, numb fingers, and the constant threat of being knocked unconscious or simply ripped from their perch and plunged into the churning abyss below. A single misstep, a moment of weakness, or a sudden gust of wind meant instant death, swallowed by the frothing waves, never to be seen again. The deck itself became a treacherous, unpredictable terrain, slick with seawater, strewn with broken rigging and loose debris. Men often lashed themselves to the mast or rails, simply to avoid being washed overboard by rogue waves, which could sweep across the entire deck with irresistible force, dragging unfortunate souls into the cold embrace of the deep. Even below deck, safety was far from assured. Cargo shifted dangerously in the violent movements, crushing men against bulkheads. Loose cannons or other heavy objects, unmoored from their lashings, could roll freely, smashing through the fragile hull, or dismembering anyone caught in their path. The ship, which was their only refuge, became their most immediate threat. Beyond the meteorological, the age of discovery also carried with it a lingering, pervasive dread of the truly monstrous. Sailors of this era lived in a world steeped in legend and superstition, where the vast, unexplored ocean was not merely a physical space, but a psychological canvas onto which their deepest fears were projected. Tales of immense sea serpents, often called leviathans, powerful enough to coil around and capsize an entire ship, were not merely campfire stories but grim possibilities. Whispers of giant kraken-like creatures, capable of dragging a vessel into the depths with their colossal tentacles, struck profound fear into the hearts of hardened seamen. Maps, even authoritative ones, often depicted fantastical beasts in their uncharted margins, lending an air of credence to these terrors. Every unusual current, every strange sound from the dark waters, every unidentified distant splash could trigger widespread panic, leading men to imagine horrors lurking just beneath the surface. This blend of the unknown and the deeply ingrained superstitious belief meant that a significant part of the journey involved not only combating tangible natural forces, but also battling the spectral, overwhelming fear of primeval, supernatural denizens of the deep. For a chilling number of voyages, these natural forces proved to be insurmountable, resulting in devastating losses that shaped the course of exploration and reminded humanity of its profound insignificance in the face of a wild planet. Shipwreck was an alarmingly common outcome, whether caused by colossal waves smashing a hull, being driven onto a jagged coastline, or simply springing an irrecoverable leak after incessant pounding. When a ship was condemned, the end was often swift and merciless. For those few who managed to escape the sinking vessel, usually into small open lifeboats or even by clinging to flotsam, the battle for survival had only just begun. Cast adrift on the vast ocean, often with minimal water and no provisions, these survivors faced a new, excruciating form of slow torment. Exposure to the elements, blistering sun by day, freezing temperatures by night, relentless thirst, and the ever-present gnawing of hunger, coupled with the psychological torture of being alone in the vast empty expanse, watching their companions slowly perish, one by one. The sight of a familiar flag, the sound of another ship, became the most elusive and desperate hope, rarely realised. Most of these scattered, desperate survivors were never seen or heard from again, their fleeting struggle lost to the depths, becoming just another forgotten statistic in the brutal accounting of imperial expansion, another silent sacrifice to the untamed ocean. The initial awe and trepidation that marked the explorers' first sight of uncharted lands were quickly overshadowed by a different, often more immediate, set of terrors, the perils of direct human conflict. While popular narratives frequently cast the Age of Discovery as a heroic tale of intrepid explorers planting flags on virgin soil, the reality was a brutal, bloody collision of cultures driven by fear, greed, and a fundamental misunderstanding of disparate worldviews. The moment of first contact between European explorers and the indigenous peoples of newly discovered lands was rarely one of harmonious exchange. Instead, it was frequently fraught with tension, suspicion, and a chilling prelude to violence. From the moment the European sails appeared on the horizon, an unprecedented disturbance rippled through established native societies, viewed either as the arrival of gods or, more often, as an invasion. European explorers, for their part, harboured a mix of curiosity, a desire for trade, and an underlying sense of superiority. This explosive cocktail of alien perspectives often led to devastating consequences. The genesis of these conflicts was often rooted in simple, profound misunderstandings and fundamentally opposing objectives. Europeans sought gold, land, converts, and trade routes, often perceiving indigenous resources as theirs for the taking, and indigenous populations as subservient. Native peoples, meanwhile, wished to preserve their autonomy, their lands, and their traditions, which were intricately woven with their ancestral territories. These clashing motivations inevitably led to friction. A European demand for supplies, interpreted as a territorial claim, could trigger a swift and decisive response. An indigenous act of perceived aggression, such as guarding a resource or declining a trade offer, could be met with overwhelming force by the technologically superior Europeans. Initial exchanges, sometimes amicable, could quickly sour over a perceived insult, the theft of a trinket, or an aggressive push into sacred lands. What began as cautious curiosity swiftly devolved into a desperate struggle for survival, a bloody, often unwritten chapter of history defined by fear and mistrust. The Europeans possessed distinct military advantages that frequently decided the outcomes of these violent clashes. Steel weapons, swords, lances, and knives offered a cutting edge far superior to stone, obsidian, or even hardened wooden armaments. Armour, though cumbersome and stifling in tropical climates, offered a degree of protection largely impenetrable by indigenous projectiles. firearms, even the early, slow-loading matchlocks and arquebuses, provided a terrifying psychological impact with their thunderous noise and plumes of smoke, and their capacity to kill from a distance, without immediate retaliation. Perhaps most devastatingly, European ships served as mobile, formidable platforms of war. Cannons mounted on naval vessels could lay waste to coastal settlements with their explosive force, shattering resistance from afar before land parties even disembarked. The horses, too, alien to many indigenous societies, particularly in the Americas, caused widespread panic, representing an unholy combination of speed, power, and psychological terror. This technological disparity did not, however, guarantee swift victory. Indigenous populations often possessed superior knowledge of the terrain, numbers, and the capacity for relentless guerrilla warfare, turning exploration into protracted, brutal conflicts where attrition, rather than outright victory, defined the engagements. Resistance from indigenous peoples was widespread, courageous, and often merciless, driven by a fierce desire to defend their homelands and way of life. When direct confrontation failed, tactics often shifted to ambush, psychological warfare, and exploiting the weaknesses of their European invaders. Arrows, poisoned darts, and spears were often used with devastating effectiveness in close-quarters combat or from the cover of dense vegetation. Indigenous warriors frequently targeted specific vulnerabilities, such as European reliance on horses, their limited numbers, or their vulnerability to tropical diseases. Traps, clever diversions, and knowledge of treacherous landscapes turned familiar environments into deadly labyrinths for the invaders. When capturing European soldiers, retribution could be exceptionally brutal, involving torture, sacrifice, or ritualized dismemberment, acts driven by a desperate attempt to restore balance, ward off further encroachment, or instill fear in the remaining European forces. These acts of resistance ensured that almost every landing, every foray into the interior, and every attempt at establishing a foothold became a perilous undertaking for the explorers, a journey fraught with the very real and present danger of being killed, captured, or driven back into the unforgiving sea. The perceived exoticism of new lands was constantly undermined by the terrifying reality of pitched, brutal engagements with fiercely defiant native populations. Beyond the conflicts with native populations, explorers also found themselves embroiled in a different kind of warfare. The ruthless, often clandestine, struggles between rival European powers. The Age of Discovery was fundamentally an era of fierce geopolitical competition, a frantic race among empires for land, resources, and trade dominance. Nations like Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands regarded new territories as their exclusive property to be seized and defended with armed might. This meant that an explorer, having successfully navigated perilous seas and survived encounters with indigenous peoples, might then face the equally deadly prospect of confrontation with a ship, or even a fleet, flying a rival European flag. These encounters were not bound by gentlemanly rules of war. Acts of piracy, outright battles for possession of newly found islands, and the systematic sabotage of rival expeditions were common. A captain might seize a rival's newly compiled charts, plunder their provisions, or even capture and execute their crew, ensuring that all prior sacrifices on the voyage had been for naught. The promise of glory could easily devolve into an internecine bloodbath on the high seas, far from the watchful eyes of their distant monarchs, turning erstwhile allies into ruthless enemies for the sake of colonial gain. The constant threat of human conflict, whether from indigenous resistance or rival European powers, profoundly impacted the daily lives and psychological states of the explorers. Every landing was an act of high risk, every journey through a new forest, a venture into potential ambush. Men were expected to be perpetually vigilant, sleeping lightly with weapons at hand, and engaging in frequent drills. The lines between exploration, conquest, and piracy blurred into a single, terrifying enterprise. The psychological toll of living under such persistent threat of violence was immense. Paranoia became a constant companion, turning every rustle in the leaves, every distant smoke plume, and every unfamiliar sail on the horizon into a harbinger of potential doom. The relentless readiness for combat added another layer of physical and mental exhaustion to an already debilitating journey. Casualties were high. Not only were men killed in direct engagements, but also wounded in skirmishes. Their injuries, untreatable in such remote conditions, often leading to slow, agonizing deaths from infection or blood loss. The bodies of fallen comrades, whether left on foreign shores or committed to the waves, served as chilling reminders that their quest for discovery was, for many, a march toward a violent and often anonymous end. The dream of untouched paradises was continuously shattered by the echoing cries of battle and the very real cost of empire. Amidst the myriad perils of exploration, one specific terror loomed largest and was perhaps most universal: the dreaded shipwreck. It represented the ultimate, abrupt end to all dreams and ambitions, transforming a sturdy vessel, the sole bastion of security, into a splintered coffin on the tumultuous waves. A ship might simply spring a leak, initially imperceptible, then growing into an unstoppable deluge as timbers parted and water rushed in. Or it might strike an uncharted reef or hidden rock, a sickening crunch echoing through the hull, followed by the terrifying groan of splintering wood, signalling the rapid ingress of the sea. Fire, sparked by a stray ember, a lantern knocked over, or spontaneous combustion in a dark hold, was another dreaded culprit. In an age of wooden ships smeared with tar and loaded with gunpowder, a fire could consume a vessel with shocking speed, transforming it into a blazing inferno on the water. These catastrophic events were rarely slow. They were moments of extreme chaos and primal fear, often striking in the dead of night or during the furious onslaught of a storm, granting little time for escape or contemplation, merely a frantic struggle against inevitable oblivion. The immediate aftermath of a shipwreck was a scene of utter, uncontrolled pandemonium and despair. The cacophony of splintering wood, shrieking winds, and crashing waves was overwhelming. Orders barked by officers were often drowned out or disregarded in the raw scramble for survival. Sailors, thrown from their berths or flung across the deck by violent lurches, desperately fought to stay afloat in the roiling water, battling the cold, the strong currents, and the debris of their shattered vessel. Many were pulled under by the sucking currents created by a rapidly sinking hull, or crushed by shifting cargo. Those who managed to cling to wreckage or scramble into an overcrowded lifeboat faced a grim reality. Lifeboats, small and unequipped, were never intended for long-term survival, but rather for a fleeting hope of immediate rescue. Packed to the brim, often leaking, and dangerously unstable, they merely offered a delayed death sentence. The frantic scramble to gather any supplies a small amount of biscuit, a flask of water, was usually haphazard, driven by terror, and largely unsuccessful. The cold, the exhaustion, and the profound psychological shock quickly took their toll, and many perished in the first hours or days after abandoning ship, victims not of the initial calamity, but of the cruel exposure and overwhelming despair. For those few who miraculously survived the immediate calamity and found themselves marooned on a desolate, previously unmapped island, a new, prolonged, and agonizing battle for survival began. These were rarely the lush, palm-fringed paradises of romantic tales. More often, they were barren, water, scarce outcrops of rock, or dense, hostile jungle enclaves devoid of human habitation. Their first, most critical task was the desperate search for fresh water. Without it, survival was measured in mere days. Often, this meant digging shallow wells in sandy soil, hoping for a meagre trickle, or collecting morning dew from leaves, a painstakingly slow and often insufficient method. Food was equally elusive. The land might offer unfamiliar plants, some edible, others poisonous, requiring dangerous experimentation. Hunting was rudimentary, limited by whatever makeshift tools they could fashion and their own dwindling strength. Seabirds, their eggs, and the occasional fish or shellfish provided a sparse and unvaried diet, insufficient to stem the pervasive gnawing of starvation. Every moment was consumed by the primitive, brutal struggle for sustenance, reducing intelligent men to mere hunter-gatherers battling for existence in a hostile, indifferent environment. The daily realities of island survival relentlessly pushed men to the absolute brink of human endurance. Constructing rudimentary shelters from branches and leaves offered meagre protection against the elements. The scorching sun, drenching rain, and chilling night winds. Disease, already a relentless foe on the ship, followed them ashore, compounded by new tropical maladies like malaria or dengue fever, for which they had no immunity and no cures. Insects, ubiquitous and unrelenting, carried both discomfort and contagion. Exposure, particularly if rescue was slow in coming, led to severe sunburns, skin lesions, and rampant infections from unattended wounds or abrasions. Sleep was constantly interrupted by hunger, fear, and the pervasive discomfort of the wild environment. Psychological deterioration mirrored the physical decline. The isolation, the constant fear of unknown dangers, and the crushing despair of their seemingly hopeless situation gnawed at their minds, often leading to apathy, profound depression, and ultimately, a quiet, gradual surrender to death. Each sunset was a grim reminder of another day closer to the end, another day of brutal, meaningless toil under an indifferent sky. In the extreme desperation of protracted isolation, the veneer of civilization often wore thin, revealing the darkest facets of human nature. Resources dwindled, strength waned, and the struggle for survival sharpened into a merciless, every man for himself reality. Accounts of mutiny, outright theft, and vicious fights over the last scrap of food, or last drop of water, became commonplace. For a horrifying, though rare, number of survivors, prolonged starvation on a deserted island pushed them to the ultimate taboo: cannibalism. Stories, grim and often whispered, from such dire situations recount individuals, driven by maddening hunger, resorting to consuming the bodies of their deceased comrades as a last, desperate attempt at survival. This act, unthinkable under normal circumstances, became a grotesque necessity, a final descent into utter inhumanity forced by the unbearable pangs of an empty stomach. These experiences left indelible scars, even for those who survived. The memory of such a desperate violation of all human norms haunted them, should they ever return to civilization. This chilling erosion of moral boundaries, in the face of absolute privation, illustrated the terrifying depths to which human beings could be driven when stripped of all hope and faced with the stark, relentless imperative to simply continue existing. The chances of rescue were infinitesimally small, a statistic that haunted the waking thoughts of every castaway. Uncharted islands were, by definition, outside established shipping lanes, making serendipitous discovery a cruel long shot. Any distress signals they could produce smoke from a distant fire, crude flags fashioned from salvaged cloth, were minuscule against the vastness of the ocean, easily missed by the infrequent passing vessel. The limited range of early telescopes, and the inherent dangers of veering off course for unknown sightings, meant that many signals simply went unnoticed. For days, weeks, months, or even years, these marooned explorers lived on the razor's edge of a slim hope, staring at an empty horizon, each distant cloud or faint glimmer an object of desperate, crushing speculation, only to reveal itself as nothing. The long wait eroded not just physical health, but the very will to survive. When a ship was eventually spotted, it was often the final burst of energy, the last, desperate sprint of their exhausted bodies and minds. often ending in profound disappointment as the sail shrank back into the blue, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a reinforced and deepening despair. The ultimate fate of countless shipwrecked explorers remains tragically unknown, etched only as unanswered questions in the grand tapestry of discovery. No chronicles, no logbooks, no final words recorded their end. They simply vanished, becoming part of the untold history of the age of discovery's casualties. Their suffering, immense and prolonged, concluded in the quiet isolation of some forgotten island, their bones likely becoming part of the untamed landscape, weathering under the relentless sun and rain. These anonymous deaths served as chilling counterpoints to the celebrated tales of grand conquests and triumphant returns. They represented the vast, silent majority of adventurers, for whom the dream of discovery turned into a drawn-out, excruciating nightmare, their final resting places unknown, their bodies claimed by the very wildness they sought to conquer. Their stories, lost to the waves and the dense jungle, offer a grim and sobering counter-narrative to the heroic narratives, a silent testament to the countless unheroic endings that characterized the Age of Discovery for so many. For the beleaguered explorers of the Age of Discovery, sighting a distant coastline, particularly one adorned with the bustling promise of a foreign port, brought a complex wave of emotions. After months of grueling isolation at sea, the sight of land offered a primal relief, a temporary respite from the ship's claustrophobic confines, and a fleeting promise of fresh food and water. Yet, this momentary euphoria was often deceptive, a cruel mirage. For all the anticipated comfort, these exotic, often unruly ports were far from sanctuaries. Instead, they quickly transformed into new, equally insidious battlegrounds, rife with novel diseases, unbridled violence, and a labyrinth of traps laid by desperate opportunists. What initially appeared as salvation often became just another lethal phase of their journey, an intersection where fresh dangers intertwined with old, familiar miseries. The very act of resupply, a necessity for survival, exposed them to vulnerabilities unknown on the open sea, making the supposedly safe havens little more than glorified disease vectors and criminal havens. Perhaps the most pervasive and silently devastating threat encountered in these bustling foreign ports was an entirely new spectrum of disease. European sailors, often carrying immunities to their native pathogens, possessed little to no resistance against the myriad of tropical illnesses that flourished in warmer, unfamiliar climates. Malaria, spread by the ubiquitous mosquito, could quickly incapacitate entire crews with its recurrent, debilitating fevers, chills, and profound weakness. Dengue fever, yellow fever, and various forms of tropical fever siege, with their own agonizing symptoms, from excruciating joint pain to severe hemorrhagic manifestations, became sudden and silent epidemics, transforming a dockside stroll into a deadly gamble. Unlike the slow agony of scurvy, these new illnesses often struck with alarming rapidity, felling robust men in a matter of days or weeks, turning bustling crews into phantom ships as illness ravaged their ranks. The conditions within the ports themselves, often crowded, unsanitary, and lacking proper sewage systems, served as perfect breeding grounds for these and other highly contagious diseases, exacerbating the spread from local populations to the susceptible sailors, trapping them in a cycle of suffering that belied the temporary promise of land. Beyond these newly encountered diseases, the seaports, particularly those serving as long-distance maritime hubs, were often infamous for the rapid spread of sexually transmitted infections. The prolonged abstinence and extreme stress of a voyage often drove sailors to seek out carnal release upon arrival despite the inherent risks. Without any scientific understanding of contagion, and with moral inhibitions often loosened by copious alcohol and desperate urges, diseases such as syphilis and gonorrhea spread unchecked. These ailments, once contracted, brought with them not just immediate physical suffering in the form of painful lesions, rashes, and discharge, but also severe long-term complications. Syphilis, in particular, could progress to inflict horrifying damage years after the initial infection, affecting the bones, brain, and internal organs, leading to crippling pain, madness, disfigurement, and premature death. Such diseases did not just affect the individual, they debilitated crews, rendered men incapable of strenuous labour, and ultimately compromised the viability of the expedition. The transient, often chaotic nature of these port cities meant that sailors rarely stayed long enough to receive any sustained treatment, if indeed any effective remedies existed, leaving them to carry the insidious infection back to their ship and companions, an invisible, festering reminder of a fleeting moment of solace. The vibrant, albeit chaotic, atmosphere of foreign ports often concealed an underlying brutality, a world operating with little, if any, official law enforcement. For explorers stepping onto unfamiliar shores, accustomed to the stringent, if harsh, discipline of their own ship, this absence of predictable order often plunged them into immediate danger. Alcohol, freely available and consumed in excess, was a prime catalyst for conflict. Sailors, relieved from the rigid structure of sea life and often nursing deep-seated resentments from their long voyages, engaged in frequent, brutal brawls with other mariners, local thugs, or even their own shipmates, settling scores, or simply acting on drunken impulses. These were not always spontaneous eruptions. Sailors often fell victim to organised crime. Predatory locals, keen to exploit the tired, often naive foreigners, would set up ambushes, leading unsuspecting sailors into dark alleyways where they would be beaten, robbed, and left for dead. The pursuit of easy money often resulted in crippling injuries, a sailor losing his teeth, an eye, or suffering a permanent limp, wounds far more painful and persistent than anything gained from their fleeting freedom ashore. For these victims, the shore represented not freedom, but a new kind of trap, where every shadowed street corner held a lurking danger more sinister than any storm at sea. Beyond direct violence, these foreign ports were treacherous waters for exploitation, kidnapping, and the ever-present threat of forced servitude or outright slavery. Impressment, the act of forcing men into naval service, was a common, brutal practice by naval press gangs of other European powers who would scour the taverns and docks for fresh recruits, often targeting exhausted, disoriented foreign sailors. An innocent drink could quickly turn into a nightmare, as a man found himself knocked unconscious, dragged aboard a foreign vessel, and waking up days later with no memory of his recruitment and no hope of escape. Local crime rings often targeted sailors who strayed too far from their ship, kidnapping them and selling them into various forms of bondage, from indentured servitude on distant plantations to literal chattel slavery in exotic, foreign markets, condemning them to a brutal, hopeless life, far from any chance of rescue or repatriation. Confidence tricks and elaborate scams were also prevalent, with unscrupulous merchants or locals luring sailors into rigged gambling games, exorbitant debts, or outright fraudulent schemes, stripping them of their meagre earnings or the few valuables they possessed. An innocent night of supposed revelry could quickly turn into a desperate spiral, as an explorer found himself destitute, trapped by debts, and far from the protective sphere of his own vessel, his initial brief freedom eroding into profound destitution and profound new miseries. The profound lack of established legal systems in these newly established colonial outposts or far-flung trading posts further exacerbated the dangers. Unlike European home ports, where some semblance of law, however imperfect, provided a minimal layer of protection, these remote settlements often operated under an ad hoc, frequently brutal, system of justice where power was absolute and recourse non-existent. A sailor caught in a brawl could be arbitrarily thrown into a pestilential prison, or subjected to brutal, often fatal, summary justice by local authorities or vigilantes. Property disputes, accusations of theft, or even mere misunderstandings could escalate rapidly with little to no legal representation or due process. Sailors, as foreign nationals with limited knowledge of local customs or language, were particularly vulnerable. They were often viewed as expendable assets, their rights virtually non-existent, leaving them susceptible to exploitation by local officials, merchants, or powerful landowners. Without the protection of their own state, or proper diplomatic representation, their lives were often entirely at the mercy of capricious, sometimes savage, local ordinances. A terrifying reminder that even in ports there was no true respite from the perils of the uncivilized, wilder world that characterized so much of the Age of Discovery. For explorers who managed to avoid the worst of the disease and direct violence, the constant demands of replenishing the ship remained a relentless, often dehumanizing, ordeal. The brief stops in port were rarely a time for true rest and recuperation, particularly for the common crew. Instead, they involved arduous labour, rolling heavy casks of fresh water and salted provisions aboard, repairing damaged rigging and sails, scrubbing the foul holds, and endless tasks required to prepare the vessel for its next harrowing leg of the journey. This meant that the promised rest was illusory. They simply traded one form of relentless toil for another, their bodies never truly recuperating from the accumulated stresses of the voyage. The very reason for coming ashore, the urgent need for supplies, often robbed them of any genuine leisure, deepening their fatigue and leaving them still profoundly vulnerable to the diseases and violence that permeated these crowded, chaotic environments. These ports, therefore, functioned less as welcoming havens and more as necessary, albeit terrifying, staging post points of brief, false promise, where new sufferings were exchanged for old, ensuring that the explorer's ordeal rarely abated, even when their feet touched dry land. Beyond the external perils of sea and shore, explorers lived under the constant, often suffocating tyranny of their own shipboard hierarchy. On the vast, isolating expanse of the ocean, the captain reigned supreme, his authority absolute and virtually unchecked. The ship was a miniature kingdom, and he, its unquestioned monarch. His word was law, his judgment final, and his will often the only force maintaining order amidst profound privation and fear. This immense power was a necessary evil, designed to prevent chaos and maintain cohesion in environments where life hung by a thread and discipline was paramount. However, this power was frequently abused, creating a climate of fear that pervaded every interaction, every duty, every silent thought among the crew. There was no appeal, no higher court beyond the horizon. A captain's wrath could bring swift and terrible consequences, rendering every sailor a pawn in his solitary dominion, their lives entirely at his arbitrary mercy. The foundation of this absolute authority rested on a bedrock of rigid, often terrifying military discipline, enforced through a repertoire of brutal physical punishments. The most notorious and feared of these was flogging, administered with a cat-o'-nine tails, a whip composed of a wooden handle from which 9 knotted cords, often tipped with lead balls or metal pieces, extended. This instrument was specifically designed to tear flesh. For infractions ranging from insubordination, dereliction of duty, or petty theft, to mere insolence or idleness, a sailor might be stripped to the waist, tied to the grating, and publicly whipped before his assembled shipmates. The sight and sound of the lash biting into skin, followed by agonizing screams and the visceral smell of blood, served as a stark, chilling deterrent. But flogging was only one of many tools in the captain's punitive arsenal. Men could be put in irons, their ankles and wrists shackled, making every movement a painful struggle. They might be subjected to the garboard strake, where they were chained along the lowest timber in the ship's hull, immersed in foul bilge water, often in complete darkness, left for days or weeks. Minor missteps could also lead to reduction of rations, extra duties, or painful solitary confinement, where the mental torment could often rival the physical. Every day brought with it the silent understanding that punishment was not merely a possibility, but an ever-present spectre, ensuring that conformity was a constant, if painful, necessity. The arbitrary nature of this punishment regime made life on board a psychological minefield. Transgressions that might seem minor a slow response, a misplaced tool, a grumble about conditions, could escalate into grave offences in the captain's eyes, incurring severe, often disproportionate, penalties. The rules were interpreted not by established code, but by the capricious temper of the man in command, magnified by stress, exhaustion, or simply a bad mood. A momentary lapse in concentration due to extreme fatigue, a natural human error, could result in a brutal lashing that would leave a man crippled or scarred for life. This omnipresent threat fostered a pervasive culture of anxiety. Sailors learned to anticipate and interpret their captain's shifting moods, to keep their heads down, their voices quiet, and their actions flawless, knowing that the slightest perceived slight could turn them into public examples of merciless authority. The mental strain of this constant vigilance, of knowing one's physical integrity, lay solely at the whim of another man, was profound, a psychological weight as heavy as any physical burden they carried, transforming their environment into a cage of fear and unspoken rage. For more severe offences, the punishment could be the ultimate one. Mutiny, perceived or actual, was the gravest crime imaginable aboard a ship. A captain, living in constant fear of losing control, would swiftly and ruthlessly suppress any hint of insubordination or collective defiance. Those accused of inciting or participating in mutiny, or even just witnessing it and not reporting it, could face instant execution without trial. The common methods were hanging from the yardarm, often made agonizingly slow as a brutal public spectacle, or being shot by a firing squad composed of their own unwilling comrades. Bodies might then be deliberately left hanging for days, swaying grimly with the ship's motion, a macabre warning to any others contemplating rebellion. Beyond mutiny, theft, desertion, or persistent insolence could also carry the death penalty, sometimes by the particularly gruesome act of being keel-hauled, dragged under the barnacled, jagged hull of the ship from one side to the other, a brutal punishment that guaranteed severe lacerations and often resulted in drowning or being crushed. The decision to execute lay solely with the captain, enforced by his officers, leaving the condemned with no hope, no escape, only the stark reality of immediate death. These brutal executions served as extreme reminders of the captain's supreme authority, reinforcing the brutal message that aboard his vessel, defiance meant death. The inherent brutality of naval discipline, while meant to enforce order, also frequently had unintended consequences, driving profound despair and ultimately contributing to higher rates of mental breakdown or outright rebellion. Men, pushed beyond the limits of their physical endurance by arduous labour, hunger, and disease, found their mental state further eroded by the constant threat of pain and public humiliation. This systematic stripping away of dignity and personal agency cultivated a festering resentment, a simmering hatred beneath the forced obedience. For some, the psychological pressure of this absolute submission led to apathy and a loss of will, where even self-preservation faded. For others, however, it fueled a desperate rage, a desire for vengeance against their tormentors, transforming a simmering resentment into dangerous, often deadly, plots of mutiny. Though the captain's whip and noose kept immediate control, they paradoxically also ceded the very defiance they sought to crush, driving a small but significant number of crew to desperate, often futile, acts of violent rebellion against the tyrannical microcosm they inhabited. This brutal dialectic of power and subjugation ensured that true peace and mental well-being were virtually unknown for the vast majority of those confined to the harsh, authoritarian realm of an age of discovery ship. The long-term effects of this harsh environment on the psychology of those who endured it were profound and often permanent. Sailors who survived such brutal conditions frequently returned with a deeply ingrained mistrust of authority, a suppressed anger, and an almost instinctual readiness for violence. They carried not just physical scars, but invisible wounds from the daily indignities, the witnessed suffering, and the pervasive fear that had defined their existence. These individuals often struggled to readjust to civilian life, finding the relative freedoms jarring and often engaging in violent behaviour or struggling with persistent emotional numbing. The rigid conformity and absolute submission demanded at sea left them ill-equipped for more nuanced social interactions. For many, the memory of the lash, the scream of a punished shipmate, or the terrifying silence of an execution became a recurring nightmare, shaping their character and future in ways that extended far beyond the immediate trauma, serving as a bitter legacy of lives lived under the iron fist of maritime dictatorship. For the explorers of the Age of Discovery, survival, even against overwhelming odds, offered no guarantee of relief or reward. While tales of triumphant return, loaded with gold and spices, fueled the imaginations of the land-bound, the bleak reality, for the vast majority of these adventurers, was a soul-crushing disappointment, returning home with nothing but the tattered clothes on their backs, and the indelible scars of their ordeal. The glorious narratives often glossed over the harsh economic truths. For every successful, wealthy expedition that returned with riches, there were scores that ended in utter financial ruin, for the patrons who funded them and, more tragically, for the common sailors who gambled their lives on the venture. The expectation of vast wealth from newfound lands, often promised by charismatic captains or avaricious patrons, rarely materialized for the ordinary seaman, turning their epic struggle into a bitter, fruitless endeavor. Most men who joined these expeditions did so out of economic desperation, fueled by promises of a substantial share in any discovered treasures, or, at the very least, decent wages upon completion. However, the complex financial arrangements of the era, coupled with the exorbitant costs and inherent risks of long-distance voyages, often meant that these promised rewards dwindled to nothing or were simply withheld. Many expeditions found no gold, no silver mines, and no easily marketable spices. Instead, they returned with scientific observations, detailed maps, or perhaps a few samples of indigenous flora and fauna, all of which held little immediate economic value for a hungry, weary crew. Even for expeditions that did yield some riches, the chain of command, from the monarch down through the patrons, investors, and then to the captain, ensured that the vast bulk of any profit was siphoned off at the highest echelons. The common sailor, far down the hierarchical ladder, received a pitiful fraction, barely enough to cover the debts incurred during their absence, or to offer a brief respite before poverty once again gripped them. Adding to the crushing weight of unmet expectations were the relentless debts that accumulated during the explorer's absence. Sailors often signed on with little to no upfront pay, sometimes receiving an advance that barely covered immediate needs. To provision their families or simply secure their passage, many borrowed against their future earnings or against meagre assets left at home. Shopkeepers, landlords, and moneylenders eagerly extended credit, confident that a man returning from a lucrative voyage would be able to settle his accounts. However, when these expeditions yielded little to no profit, or when illness and injury rendered the explorer unable to work, these debts remained, often growing with exorbitant interest rates. Returning home penniless meant facing not triumph, but relentless creditors, foreclosures, and social shame. The very journey that promised an escape from poverty instead plunged them deeper into financial servitude, often leading to years of relentless struggle, forced to work at meagre wages just to survive, burdened by the ghosts of their supposed adventure. Their bodies might have survived, but their financial lives were often shattered beyond repair. For the ordinary man who had endured the indescribable horrors of such a voyage, the return was not only financially grim, but psychologically devastating. The grand narratives of heroism and discovery meticulously spun by chroniclers and sung by bards, belonged only to the fortunate few who either found staggering riches or perished dramatically, their deaths becoming romanticised martyrs' tales. For the vast majority, those who returned empty-handed and often broken in body and spirit, society offered no fanfare, no parades, and certainly no financial support. They were simply, silently, forgotten. Their tales of scurvy, starvation, storms, and the unseen horrors of the ocean were too grim, too unsettling, to be celebrated. These unvarnished realities clashed too harshly with the carefully constructed myth of glorious exploration. Instead, these men often faced a profound indifference, a society unwilling to acknowledge their immense sacrifices, and a public hungry only for success stories, not for the painful truths of arduous survival. Their profound suffering was deemed too mundane, too common, to warrant recognition or praise. Beyond mere indifference, these returning explorers often faced active scorn and mockery. If a voyage was publicly deemed a failure, whether due to lack of discoveries, insufficient wealth, or severe loss of life, the surviving crew members were implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, held responsible for the wasted resources and failed hopes. They were ridiculed in taverns, pointed at as examples of foolish gambles, their empty hands and haunted eyes serving as evidence of their failure. The heroic aura of explorer faded, replaced by the grim label of loser or beggar, forever associated with the disastrous venture. The investors, who had lost fortunes on the expedition, harboured resentment, sometimes seeking legal recourse or public shaming. This public humiliation, piled atop the financial ruin and physical suffering, crushed any lingering remnants of self-respect. They were forced to relive their arduous journeys not through glorious memory, but through the scornful gazes of their neighbours, becoming living embodiments of failed ambition, a walking testament to dreams that died on the distant horizon, bringing back only an unwanted burden of failure and social disgrace. For those few who truly believed in the geographic or scientific goals of exploration, distinct from the allure of gold, the disillusionment was profound. To return with invaluable charts, detailed accounts of unknown lands, or observations of new celestial bodies, only to find society prioritising monetary gain over intellectual advancement, was a bitter pill. These explorers had braved incredible dangers, pushed the boundaries of human knowledge, endured immense suffering to fill in the blanks on maps, to understand the currents, or to record new species. Yet, their findings were often dismissed as secondary, irrelevant, if not immediately profitable. The thrill of discovery, the intellectual conquest, was overlooked in favour of purely mercantile interests. This dismissal of their intellectual contributions meant that their most profound sacrifices, the very ones that truly propelled knowledge forward, were deemed worthless by the very powers that had sponsored their journey. The grand adventure of expanding the known world was ultimately reduced to a mercenary calculation, leaving them with a hollow feeling, a quiet realization that their real achievements went unrecognized, eclipsed by the pursuit of ephemeral wealth. The ultimate tragedy for many returning explorers, especially those crippled by injuries or chronic illnesses contracted abroad, was their permanent displacement within society. A sailor who returned from a long voyage missing an arm or perpetually weakened by tropical fever found his capacity for hard labour severely diminished. With no social safety nets, no pensions, and often no family left to support them, these broken men faced immediate and inescapable destitution. They joined the ranks of the visible poor, relegated to begging on the same streets they once hoped to depart from with riches. Their expertise, once valued for the hazardous journey, became worthless on land. The specific, niche skills honed on the high seas were largely irrelevant to the civilian economy. Their years of perilous exploration left them unfit for productive labour and isolated from established communities. These crippled, destitute men, once aspiring adventurers, served as grim, walking cautionary tales of the age of discovery. Bodies that had cheated death at sea, only to find a slow, drawn-out demise awaited them in the squalid alleyways and impoverished quarters of their supposedly safe home. Their very existence became a public shame, a symbol not of conquest, but of society's profound neglect. This bitter culmination of endless debt, social dismissal, and the profound lack of recognitions meant it a pervasive cycle of economic misery and human despair that underpinned much of the Age of Discovery. The narrative, as celebrated through the ages, focused on the few shining exceptions: the Magellans who circumnavigated, the Columbuses who found land. It glossed over the countless anonymous dead, the countless unrich, who returned home with nothing but their nightmares, or those who barely made it back, only to live out a desperate, shortened existence in poverty. The dream of fortune was a seductive siren song, but for most it was a deceitful lure that pulled them into a lifetime of struggle, offering only the illusory promise of gold, and delivering instead a prolonged period of crushing poverty and an ignominious fade from memory. For these forgotten figures, their journey was less a heroic quest and more a gradual, agonizing disillusionment, culminating not in celebration but in the quiet, crushing realization that their grandest gamble had ultimately cost them everything and left them with nothing at all. For the exceedingly rare individuals who defied the astronomical odds of death by disease, starvation, storms and violence, and finally, miraculously, set foot on their native soil once more, the ordeal of the Age of Discovery did not cease. The termination of the voyage often heralded not relief, but a new, insidious phase of suffering. The quiet, pervasive torment of being a survivor, permanently marked by unspeakable experiences. Their bodies, if not wholly broken, carried the indelible etchings of protracted hardship, and their minds, far from finding peace, were often besieged by a different kind of war. This return was rarely a triumph. For most, it was a profound, disorienting entry into a world that had moved on without them, a stark, unwelcome reminder of how profoundly their identities had been reshaped by their journey to the abyss. Physically, the returned explorer was often a mere shadow of the man who had departed. Years of unrelenting hardship, of exposure to brutal elements, and chronic malnutrition had left their bodies profoundly damaged. Many carried chronic illnesses, insidious diseases contracted in distant, tropical lands that manifested long after their initial exposure. Malaria, yellow fever, or debilitating tropical dysentery often settled into their systems, leading to recurrent fevers, incapacitating weakness, and chronic pain that rendered daily life a constant battle. Scurvy, even if not immediately fatal, had frequently stripped them of teeth, left their gums perpetually bleeding, or weakened their bones and joints, resulting in painful, enduring arthritis or crippling immobility. Their skin, once robust, was now prematurely aged, scarred by sun, wind, and countless untreated lesions or infections. Missing limbs, the tragic result of shipboard accidents, battle wounds, or gangrenous infections, were alarmingly common, marking them instantly as casualties of a world that refused to conform to their expectations. These physical impairments often meant an end to their former occupations, leaving them permanently disadvantaged in a society with little compassion or support for the disabled, forcing them into a precarious existence on the fringes. However, often more devastating than the visible physical scars were the profound, often invisible, psychological wounds. Modern understanding would identify this as a form of post-traumatic stress disorder, though the concept was millennia away. Explorers had witnessed horrors beyond imagination, the slow, agonizing deaths of comrades, the terror of sinking ships, the desperate struggle for survival, brutal acts of violence committed by and against humans, and their own proximity to the brink of death. These cumulative traumas festered in their minds, leading to a host of debilitating symptoms. Vivid, terrifying nightmares, replaying scenes of shipwreck or famine, tormented their sleep, making genuine rest an impossibility. Many suffered from severe anxiety, an acute awareness of threat that lingered long after the danger had passed. Loud noises, sudden movements, or the sight of something reminiscent of their ordeal could trigger debilitating flashbacks or panic attacks, transporting them back to the hellish confines of their past. Socially, they became profoundly alienated, struggling to relate to a world that could not comprehend their experiences. They found comfort in silence, withdrawal, and the solitude of their own tortured minds, often leading to deep, pervasive depression that cast a grey pall over every waking moment. The process of readjusting to land life was fraught with bewildering challenges, akin to an alien returning to a changed world. Years of the ocean's rhythm, the constant swaying of the ship, the extreme scarcity of resources, and the immediate proximity of death had forged a different kind of being. Now, surrounded by an abundance of simple comforts, the noise of bustling towns, and the unfamiliar faces of loved ones who had aged and changed, many found themselves profoundly disoriented. The routines of land, the stability, the predictable comforts, felt strangely artificial and sometimes overwhelming. Their minds and bodies, accustomed to a perpetual state of vigilance and crisis, struggled to adapt to peace. Sleep, even when it came, often left them unrested, still processing the unprocessed memories. For some, the transition back was so jarring that they could not, or would not, reintegrate into civilian society, choosing instead to drift, often as perpetual vagrants or impoverished outcasts, forever bound to the sea's rhythms in their minds, longing for the known misery over the strange normalcy they could no longer understand. Their previous identity was a casualty, replaced by a ghost. A particularly cruel aspect of the explorers' return was the societal response to their unvarnished truths. The public, fueled by grand imperial narratives, expected heroic tales of conquest, golden finds, and thrilling discoveries. They did not wish to hear about the squalid living conditions, the agonizing deaths by disease, the hunger-induced cannibalism, or the soul-crushing despair. Such stark realities undermined the heroic myth and hinted at a far more unsettling, barbaric truth about humanity's expansion. Consequently, for the vast majority of returning explorers who did not bring back quantifiable riches or heroic tales, their immense suffering was met with indifference, disbelief, or even active dismissal. Their recounting of grim details was often perceived as whining, or even exaggerated, for want of the glorious. They were forgotten, quietly relegated to the anonymous margins of history, their bravery, endurance, and sacrifice unacknowledged and uncelebrated. Their stories of quiet agony, far from contributing to the heroic saga of their era, were simply left untold, pushed aside in favour of a more palatable, marketable version of discovery, leaving the survivors to bear the burden of their silent suffering in a world that refused to truly see them. The families of these returning explorers, too, often found themselves fractured and unable to fully reconnect with the changed individuals who returned. Years of separation, coupled with the profound transformation wrought by the voyage, often created an unbridgeable chasm. Children had grown into strangers, spouses had built lives independently, assuming the absent explorer to be dead. Financial destitution, physical disfigurement, and the explorer's own deep-seated trauma often meant that rather than becoming a reuniting force, they became a new burden on a household that had already adapted to their absence. Many returning explorers, burdened by overwhelming guilt or deep-seated aphasia from their psychological scars, found themselves incapable of articulating their experiences, unable to share the terrors that consumed them. This communicative breakdown often led to further emotional distance, alienation, and a slow, painful severing of familial bonds, replacing the promise of joyous reunion with a profound and aching solitude. For many, their personal narrative ended not with glory or wealth, but with the quiet tragedy of a man irrevocably lost to his own former life, stranded in a world that he no longer recognised, nor one that recognised him, becoming a forgotten monument to a terrible private victory. Their final days were often marked by destitution and social isolation. Unable to find gainful employment due to their physical and mental scars, many drifted into beggary, or laboured in the most arduous and demeaning jobs that paid a pittance. The few who recounted their adventures in taverns were often ridiculed as drunks spinning tall tales, or shunned for the grim, unappetising realities they spoke of. Society simply did not want to hear it. Without the support systems prevalent today, the traumatised and the disabled were left to fend for themselves. Their homes, if they had any, often consisted of impoverished lodgings in crowded slums, a grim final echo of the cramped conditions endured on board ship. The celebrated Age of Discovery, for these thousands upon thousands of unknown individuals, ended not with the triumphant sound of trumpets or the clinking of coins, but with the quiet, persistent gnawing of hunger, the chronic ache of disease, and the pervasive despair of minds shattered beyond repair. Their legacies were not enshrined in maps or historical texts, but whispered in the shadows of forgotten streets, poignant reminders that progress, as celebrated by humanity, often came at an unimaginable, dehumanizing cost to the very souls who carved the way, only to be abandoned to their private suffering, becoming spectres of unacknowledged agony. Beyond the calculated dangers of disease, hunger, and human conflict, explorers confronted an array of challenges far more primal and omnipresent: the sheer, untamed extremes of the Earth's natural environments. The Age of Discovery demanded passage through every conceivable climate, from the scorching deserts to the suffocating jungles, from the frozen vastness of the poles to the relentless humidity of the tropics. For men equipped with rudimentary clothing, ill-prepared vessels, and an almost complete ignorance of physiology, each new ecosystem became a fresh, often lethal, torment, pushing the human body beyond its absolute breaking point, stripping away its resilience until only raw, unprotected flesh remained, utterly vulnerable to the planet's elemental might. The equator and its surrounding tropical zones presented a formidable and unrelenting adversary. Oppressive, stifling heat, combined with suffocating humidity. Beneath a relentless sun that beat down from a sky of blinding intensity, sailors and land parties toiled in conditions that systematically sapped their strength. The heavy, often woolen, clothing, worn for durability rather than comfort, became soaked with sweat, clinging to skin and exacerbating discomfort. Dehydration was an omnipresent threat, worsened by the continuous perspiration and the inadequate supply of fresh, potable water. Men succumbed to sunstroke, collapsing under the direct glare of the sun, their minds confused, their bodies overheated. Heat exhaustion was a daily reality, draining vitality, clouding judgment, and making strenuous labour an agonising act of sheer will. Every breath felt like inhaling steam, every movement a leaden drag, as the dense, humid air choked their lungs and rendered any exertion an unbearable struggle against their own internal furnaces. Conversely, journeys into the northern or southern extremities introduced a chilling, equally relentless torment: extreme cold. For European explorers pushing into the Arctic, or Antarctic, or even those navigating the bitter northern Atlantic winters, the environment became a cruel, pervasive adversary. Clothing was woefully inadequate. Woolen garments, once wet, lost their insulating properties, becoming heavy, frigid blankets, clinging to the skin, intensifying the biting cold. Exposed skin rapidly fell prey to frostbite, fingers and toes stiffening and losing sensation, then turning waxy white or grotesquely black as tissue dyed, eventually requiring amputation without ceremony. Icy winds, unimpeded by land or substantial shelter, whipped across the decks, chilling men to the bone and increasing the risk of hypothermia. Even below deck, dampness permeated everything, and without proper heating, the cold seeped into bones, making sleep a shivering, fitful struggle. The constant exertion in frigid conditions depleted energy rapidly, pushing bodies to the brink of collapse, making every frozen task hauling sails, chopping icy and agonizing dance with the deadly cold, leading to an insidious, slow internal shutdown where vital functions simply ceased, transforming brave men into ice-hardened cadavers. Beyond the ambient temperatures, the varied terrains encountered on exploratory ventures introduced their own suite of torturous challenges. Dense, impenetrable jungles, for instance, were a hellish labyrinth. The undergrowth was so thick that every step required hacking a path with a machete, an exhausting and endlessly frustrating endeavour. The ground, perpetually damp and riddled with unseen roots, vines, and treacherous hollows, made forward progress agonizingly slow and incredibly dangerous, with twisted ankles, bruised shins, and scraped limbs being a daily occurrence. The humidity, combining with the heat, created an atmosphere ripe for infections. Deserts, by stark contrast, offered endless stretches of barren, parched land. Here, the challenge was primarily extreme dehydration, with sources of water agonizingly scarce or non-existent, and the scorching sand burning feet through warm boots. Mountainous regions presented a relentless ascent, forcing explorers to scale steep, rocky slopes, battling altitude sickness, plummeting temperatures, and the ever-present danger of rockfalls or precipitous drops. Rivers, whether broad and fast-flowing, or narrow and winding through dense swamps, harboured their own unique array of hidden dangers, treacherous currents, submerged obstacles, and unexpected changes in depth. Every new landscape presented a new physical test, and for most, these were tests destined to fail, turning the romantic journey of discovery into an agonizing death march across a hostile planet. Compounding these environmental torments were the unseen, often overlooked, threats posed by the local fauna and flora, each uniquely adapted to its niche and almost uniformly hostile to the invading human. In tropical jungles, legions of insects became a constant, maddening torment. Swarms of mosquitoes, not merely a nuisance, but lethal vectors of malaria, dengue, and yellow fever, buzzed relentlessly, covering exposed skin in itchy, festering bites. Venomous spiders, scorpions, and unseen biting insects lurked in every shadow, their bites inflicting excruciating pain, paralyzing toxins, or severe infections. Within the murky waters of rivers and swamps, silent dangers like alligators, crocodiles, and venomous snakes lurked, waiting to snap, to coil, to deliver fatal poison. Land-based encounters with wild beasts were also terrifying possibilities. Large predators, previously unknown to European zoology, could stalk expeditions, turning human beings into unwitting prey. Beyond direct physical attack, diseases carried by wildlife, for which Europeans had no immunity, represented a constant and devastating threat. Even innocent-looking plants could hold hidden dangers. Thorns that tore flesh, sap that caused blistering rashes, or fruits that induced violent poisoning, turning every act of gathering sustenance into a gamble with life and death. The physical strain of existing within these extreme environments, often combined with malnourishment and chronic fatigue, led to constant injuries and ailments that, in their remote contexts, became fatal. Twisted ankles from hidden roots, broken bones from falls on treacherous terrain, or deep lacerations from sharp rocks or thorns were agonizing and debilitating. Without modern medicine, simple sprains could swell to immense sizes, making further travel impossible. Fractured limbs, if not treated meticulously and promptly, would almost invariably become gangrenous, requiring crude and agonizing amputation, performed by untrained hands with unsanitized tools, often without anesthesia, condemning the victim to further infection, prolonged suffering, or almost certain death. Even minor cuts and abrasions, ubiquitous in such rough environments, quickly festered and became severely infected in the absence of antiseptic practices and basic hygiene. These open wounds, attracting flies and bacteria, frequently turned into gruesome, weeping sores that left a permanent and disfiguring mark, constantly reminding the survivor of their journey to the edge of endurance. Every physical toll was amplified 100-fold by the remoteness and the cruel scarcity of effective treatment, turning simple misfortunes into a horrifying path toward a prolonged, agonizing end. Finally, getting lost in these untamed wildernesses represented a profound descent into despair, an utterly terrifying state of disorientation that severed explorers from their tenuous hold on organized existence. The vast, undifferentiated expanse of jungle, desert, or ice could swallow a man whole, leaving him irrevocably disoriented, without a compass or any reliable landmarks. Distances, especially with diminishing supplies and waning strength, were underestimated. Small detours in search of water or a clearer path could rapidly turn into permanent separations from the main group. The sense of isolation grew with each agonizing, misdirected step. Panic would often set in, further clouding judgment and leading to desperate, illogical decisions. For those who strayed or were left behind, the grim scenario unfolded slowly. Thirst, starvation, the onset of severe exposure as day bled into night, and the terrifying knowledge that they were alone, irrevocably lost to a silent, indifferent world. The lack of rescue parties, or the sheer impossibility of locating a single lost soul in such vastness, sealed their fate. They died not in battle, nor often from dramatic accidents, but from a slow, grinding dissolution into the landscape, consumed by exposure and neglect, becoming anonymous additions to the terrifying vastness they had sought to conquer. Their stories ended not with discovery, but with the haunting emptiness of an unmarked grave in a nameless, untamed land. The grand tapestry of the Age of Discovery is typically woven with threads of triumph, innovation, and courage, portraying European explorers as heroic pioneers bravely pushing the boundaries of the known world. However, beneath this shimmering, often romanticized facade lies a dark, arterial stain of unparalleled suffering, much of it inflicted by these very discoverers upon countless indigenous populations, but also, in turn, leading to an insidious, unacknowledged burden of moral torment for the perpetrators themselves. To speak of discovery, without acknowledging the destruction, the dispossession, and the systematic decimation that accompanied it, is to willfully blind oneself to the full, gruesome reality of this pivotal era. The very act of finding a new world was, for its original inhabitants, an apocalypse, ushered in by men who often bore both disease and cruelty in equal measure. The devastating impact upon indigenous peoples began not with grand battles, but with something far more insidious: disease. European explorers, inadvertently, were the vectors of unseen death, carrying pathogens to which the native populations possessed no natural immunity. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and bubonic plague, diseases long endemic in Eurasia, unleashed unprecedented havoc on societies that had evolved in relative isolation. Villages that had thrived for centuries were reduced to charnel houses, their inhabitants dying in their thousands, bodies left untended, societies shattered by an invisible enemy. The speed and scale of these epidemics were catastrophic, preceding or accompanying direct European contact and wiping out an estimated 90% or more of some regional populations. This silent biological warfare decimated native communities, weakening their resistance to conquest and leaving them vulnerable to enslavement and forced labour. The discoverers, unknowingly or knowingly, left trails of sickness and death that often annihilated entire civilizations long before direct armed conflict commenced. Their arrivals were heralded by the stench of contagion, not the fanfare of progress. Beyond the unintentional devastation of disease, the European pursuit of resources gold, silver, land, and labour-fuelled a ruthless and systematic exploitation that brought immense, purposeful suffering to indigenous peoples. Explorers and conquistadors, driven by an insatiable hunger for wealth and power, employed brutal tactics of coercion and conquest. Entire populations were enslaved, forced to work in mines under horrific conditions, or labour on nascent colonial plantations, extracting the very riches that financed further exploration and empire. Resistance was met with overwhelming violence, massacres were common, and torture was employed as a tool of terror to subdue dissent. Women were routinely abducted and assaulted, families torn apart, and ancient social structures dismantled. The spiritual world of indigenous communities, intricately linked to their land and traditions, was desecrated by forced conversion to Christianity, often at the point of a sword. Their art, their histories, and their very identities were suppressed, replaced by a brutal new order imposed by their discoverers. This was not just about control of territory, but about the profound, dehumanizing subjugation of entire human populations, an almost total disregard for their inherent dignity and rights. The question of moral guilt on the part of the individual explorer is complex, often overlooked, yet profoundly disturbing. While many were driven by religious fervour, economic necessity, or simply the spirit of adventure, a palpable, pervasive moral decay permeated their actions. How did a man reconcile the professed tenets of his faith, often centred on mercy and justice, with the mass slaughter of unarmed people, the enslavement of innocent families, or the systematic rape and torture that were undeniably part of conquest? The psychological strain of performing or witnessing such atrocities day after day in remote lands must have left indelible scars, even on the hardened souls of these men. Did some carry the weight of these actions, returning home not just with physical scars, but with the hidden anguish of a violated conscience? History, largely written by the victors, often omits these internal struggles, but it is chilling to consider the cumulative trauma, the dehumanization required, and the psychic toll these actions extracted, not just from the victims, but also, arguably, from the perpetrators, twisting their very essence, reducing them to instruments of brutality, incapable of recognizing the depths of their own moral decay. Furthermore, the process of discovery and colonization had far-reaching, detrimental effects on the delicate balance of global ecosystems. The introduction of invasive species, whether intentional or accidental, profoundly altered native environments, pushing countless indigenous flora and fauna to extinction. Explorers often cleared vast tracts of forest for agriculture, particularly cash crops like sugar and tobacco, leading to widespread deforestation and soil erosion. The unsustainable hunting and fishing practices employed to feed large expeditions or burgeoning colonial populations led to the rapid depletion of local wildlife. Gold and silver mining operations, vital to European mercantilism, caused massive ecological damage through widespread deforestation, river contamination with mercury and other toxins used in extraction, and significant landscape degradation. This rapacious exploitation, driven by the desire for wealth and unchecked by any concept of ecological responsibility, transformed entire biomes, extinguishing unique natural heritage and setting precedents for environmental devastation that echo to the present day. The act of charting new waters inadvertently opened the floodgates to an environmental colonialism that mirrored the human tragedy, silencing landscapes just as it silenced native voices. Ultimately, the heroic narrative of the Age of Discovery served to deliberately obscure the raw, undeniable violence and suffering inherent in its process. The stories of intrepid navigators braving the elements to expand geographical knowledge were purposefully foregrounded, while the accompanying acts of conquest, enslavement, genocide, and profound environmental destruction were either sanitised, minimised, or entirely erased from official accounts. This glorification served a dual purpose: to legitimise imperial expansion and to spare the collective conscience of the burgeoning European empires the immense moral burden of their actions. The suffering of the nameless indigenous dead, the silent anguish of the enslaved, the destruction of ancient cultures, these were inconvenient truths that contradicted the triumphal narrative of progress and enlightenment. So they were buried, consciously ignored by the very people who benefited most from them. This active omission means that, for hundreds of years, much of the true history of the Age of Discovery has remained a selective, distorted myth, carefully crafted to obscure the horrifying cost at which these grand discoveries were truly made. The blood of countless souls was not just shed, but wiped clean from the narrative, leaving behind only the polished, gleaming facade of courageous adventure, and condemning their brutal truths to remain in the unheard whispers of unwritten histories.